Zechariah chapter 12, verse 1. The message of the word of Yahweh against Israel. Yahweh stretching out the heavens and laying the foundation of the earth and forming the spirit of man within him declares. All right, so before we see what he declares, there are several things that are important here. First of all, we can see that there's a message against Israel, sadly, not against the nations or not for Israel, but against, due to the sins of the people, due to our sins and to idolatry and all of the things that have been accepted throughout the apostasy. Of course, this was written before Mashiach came, but there was an apostasy in that time that would represent the apostasy that would happen during the past 2,000 years. Also, that is to show how when Mashiach came, he came for Israel to forgive sins, and now in the end times comes against, in the sense of bringing judgment as the anger of Yahweh. So, as we have seen, this whole book has to do with the coming of the two witnesses, and now we find this that says the message of the word of Yahweh against Israel. Not only is against Israel, but also says the word of Yahweh, which, as I also have explained in the past many times, we can see the process of Yahweh getting closer to humanity by the way he relates his words through the prophets, from the Torah to the writings, or even to the New Covenant, since he begins first as Elohim. Then we see Yahweh Elohim, so Yahweh through the Elohim. Then he changes to Yahweh Sabaoth, so Yahweh through Sabaoth, a different angel and different administration in the heavens. And then after that is the word of Yahweh that appears to the prophets, as it is in this case, for Zechariah is closer to the coming of Messiah than most prophets. So now we see the word of Yahweh manifesting, but in this case is against Israel. So after that, the message of the word of Yahweh against Israel. Yahweh is stretching out the heavens. Interesting that it says stretching, as in at the moment. And not that I do believe the science of the world, but you know how they say that the space is expanding. Now, my point really here would be that Yahweh is still at work, as Yahushua said. My Father works and I work. When they try to blame him of breaking the Shabbat, he said, my Father is at work and I am at work. So teaching that the Shabbat of the week is just a representation of the true Shabbat. So he's still stretching out the heavens. He's still creating, because if he wasn't, then there would be no creation. He needs to always continually want to create, or for creation to exist, in order for it to exist. So stretching out the heavens. Also, in the sense of, well, the connection I made with the expansion of the heavens, or space, as they say, that could be interpreted as the fact that he keeps on making the heavens bigger and bigger, and would make reference also to everything that will come after this reality and everything that we need or have to explore. So stretching out the heavens and laying the foundation of the earth. Once again, laying, not laid, but laying. For he needs to want creation to exist, for it to exist. It is not like some believe that he just created everything and forgot about it, because there is no way, because of how things work, that creation could work or exist if he, the creator, he who causes to exist, all of a sudden stopped paying mind to creation. So laying the foundation of the earth and forming the spirit of man within him, forming, he's still forming our spirit within us. That's why we are still a work in progress, because he's making us in his image and likeness. That's why he made creation in 6 days, and that was to represent that it would last 6 millennia, right? 6,000 years. And we are approaching that moment of change to enter the true Shabbat, in which we will already be uh, in his image and likeness. So forming the spirit of man within him, and important also, forming the spirit, not the body, which is part of what we have been studying on Shabbat, right? Regarding the flesh made of dust. So this body, according to the scriptures, was made with hands. The next body we will have will not be made with hands, will be directly made by Yahweh, therefore it will be eternal. So this body was made with hands, and here we are seeing that Yahweh is forming, but our spirit, and forming the spirit of man within him. Declares, and I'll continue in just a moment. Let me just see the Hebrew here for a second. Veyotzer ruach Adam, and who forms the spirit of man. Well, Veyotzer, yeah, so it is forming at the moment. See, I am making Jerusalem a cup of reeling to all the people all around, and also against Yahudah. And also against Yahudah, it is in the siege against Jerusalem. A lot of people, like, because of what has been going on in Israel, they connect every single verse that has to do with something like that. Of course, they connect it to what is going on right now over there. And in a way, it could be connected in a way, obviously, because of the place and the fact that it continues to be at war. But remember that most of those who are there are not true Israelites. So not everything is fulfilling at the moment, just like also I have explained how, because of what is going on over there, many talk about the war of Gog and Magog, which we have seen is a war that will happen 1,000 years from now, the true fulfillment of it, as we have seen in other studies. The war of Harmagedon, that's another thing, and it will happen soon, but it's not what is going on right now. What will happen, the war that is closest to us, it is the third world war, and that is during the second Exodus. So it says, see, I am making Jerusalem a cup of reeling to all the people all around. That is true. That is why many nations want to rule from there or have control of that part of the world, or what it represents spiritually, since it is the birthplace of the three main religions of the world. So many believe that whoever controls Jerusalem controls the world, and that's why the beast wants to rule from there. And that makes it a cup of reeling. See, I am making Jerusalem a cup of reeling to all the people all around, and also against Yahudah, it is in the siege against Jerusalem. And in that day it shall be that I make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. This is interesting because it is similar to Mashiach, who is a stone, the cornerstone, but whoever rejects Mashiach, the stone destroys them pretty much. Either becomes a stumbling block or falls on them and destroys them. Just like here is talking about Jerusalem in the same sense. And remember that Jerusalem means the teaching of Shalom, the teaching of peace. And Mashiach brought us the peace that surpasses all understanding. through his Ruach, we receive the teaching that gives us that true peace. So just like Mashiach said also that he came to bring division, because people either would be with him or against him through their belief. So the same when it comes to, for instance, now those who believe that Jerusalem belongs to the Muslim, or those who believe that it belongs to the Jewish, or those who may think that has to do with Christianity or whatever. So see, I am making Jerusalem a cup of reeling to all the people all around, and also against Yehuda. It is the siege against Jerusalem. And in that day, which normally makes reference to the end of times, when those words appear, which in Hebrew are Behaya Bayom Hahu. Behaya Bayom Hahu. And it will be in that day. So going back. And in that day shall be that I make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. All lifting it are severely injured, right? Same with Mashiach, those who try to get rid of him, those who try to reject him, eventually will have to pay for it. They will be injured by their decision. Same with Jerusalem, those who want to take it for themselves, not understanding that it is Yahweh's city and therefore his peoples. So all lifting it are severely injured, and all the nations of the earth shall be gathered against it, as it is happening little by little. Because it says all nations. That's why I say little by little, because some may say that it has been happening already, but not all nations are against it. So in that day, declares Yahweh, I strike every horse with bewilderment, and its rider with madness. And on the house of Yehudah I open my eyes, but every horse of the peoples I strike with blindness. This is a very interesting verse for several reasons. One of them, when we take in account what or how horse is pronounced in Hebrew. We have seen that previously. We'll see it in a moment again. But let me read it again. In that day, once again, end of times, when all nations will come against Jerusalem, which mainly will manifest in the war of Harmegiddo, because the third world war, which is the second Exodus, that will be obviously half of the world against the other half. Then eventually all nations will gather to go against Jerusalem, meaning against the people of Yahweh, his army. So in that day declares Yahweh, I strike every horse with bewilderment. Remember that horses represent war. So those who go to war will be losing it one way or another. I strike every horse with bewilderment, and its rider with madness. And on the house of Yehudah I open my eyes. So a couple ways of seeing this, and on the house of Yehudah I open my eyes, is he's saying, I will make everybody crazy, and then I will take care of Yehudah. I will give favor to Yehudah because I will open my eyes on the house of Yehudah. But also, remember that Yahushua came from Yehudah. Yahushua is the light, and we are only able to see with our eyes through the light, because of the light. So if we are filled with the light of Yahweh, which is Mashiach, then he's able to open his eyes through us. For remember that the soul of man is the lamp of Yahweh, and that's how he seeks everything within us and can know everything about us. So in another interpretation, as I was saying regarding this verse, and on the house of Yehudah, meaning the chosen few, I open my eyes. By having the Ruach within him, he's able to open his eyes to see how the world is, what is going on, to testify in favor or against, for the eyes have a lot to do with testimony. And also remember that the last comes as the lion of Yahudah. Through Mashiach becomes the lion of Yahudah. Mashiach, who came as the lamb, now through the last becomes the lion of Yahudah, who opens his eyes, as in comes to visit his people and see how they are doing, to gather the chosen few while the world is going crazy because they are on a horse, because they are worshiping a false doctrine that is connected to a horse. We are in a spiritual war, but people are fighting against the true mighty one by worshiping the horse, Jesus. Remember? So, verse 4, Yom Hahu, Neum Yahweh declares Yahweh, Aka Kal Sus. I will heap every horse with bewilderment, and those who write it, or the writers, with madness. And over all the house of Yahudah, I will open my eyes. You see how when it says my eyes, it says et einai. This is eyes. Et is the word that doesn't have a translation in any language other than Hebrew. I mean, doesn't mean anything, only in Hebrew. And as you can see, is formed by the aleph and the taf, as in first and last, as the two eyes. And I will open my eyes, and on the house, over the house of Yahudah, I will open my eyes. And all sus, all those who are on horses, those who follow sus. And remember that even if we don't have the hay to make it Jesus, the Zeus is key because it is the pronunciation of Zeus, who people worship as God, right? Or Dios in Spanish. Zeus was the what they would add in the names of the false Elohim to connect them to that false Elohim called Zeus. So I strike every horse with bewilderment and its rider with madness, and on the house of Yahudah I open my eyes, but every horse of the peoples I strike with blindness. So you see how, like I was saying, obviously, or I would say obviously, the simple interpretation is that Yahweh is opening his eyes over his people. Even more when we see the Hebrew, the word that is used, over his people. When Yahweh looks at someone, that's good because the light of Yahweh, just the fact, well, in fact, just the fact that Yahweh looks at something represents the fact that he wants that something to exist. So as long as Yahweh pays attention to something, that something will exist eternally. When Yahweh takes his eyes away from something, is like not paying attention to it, therefore not giving importance to it. And if the creator doesn't care about something, that something will stop existing because of what we were saying in the first verse, right? So the fact that he keeps his eyes on somebody, that means his favor. That means his light. It is part of what we pray every night that we do the study, right? The blessing of the priest of number 6. So the simple interpretation is that he's opening his eyes over Yahudah. But when we see the second part, it gives strength to the other interpretation I was mentioning. But every horse of the peoples I strike with blindness. So it is like saying Yahudah will be able to see, but the horses of the nations will be blind. So that is like saying the true belief in Yahweh, the praise of Yahweh, will open the eyes of the people who praise Yahweh. But those who pray to a horse, those who follow the horse, those who are riding a false religion, they will be stricken with blindness. They will have eyes but not see because they worship an idol, so they become like them. So the horse here represents the spiritual war, but on the wrong side represents those who follow Zeus, and therefore Jesus um, represents also those who trust in their own strength, in their money, in whatever power they think they have. So they will be blinded. There's a saying in Judaism, which is kind of like, is the copy of what Mashiach said, that nobody can worship two mighty ones because he will love one and hate the other. In Judaism, they say that nobody can ride two horses at once. So it's interesting how they put it, because they are equating pretty much what Yahushua said regarding worshiping one or the other, and they put it as nobody can ride two horses. You can only choose one horse to ride at a time. So that means you can only choose one mighty one. So it's interesting how Yahweh makes that same connection in a way over here by saying you either worship Yahweh or you are riding on horses. You are worshiping an animal. You are going straight to war and to die in it, because whatever horse you're riding is blind, right? So, and on the house of Yahudah I open my eyes. So he's giving us light, Yahushua. He's giving us sight in order to understand the scriptures and what we believe in, while the others are running straight to war blinded. And the leaders of Yahudah shall say in their heart, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are a strength to me, through Yahweh of hosts, their Elohim. And the leaders of Yahudah shall say in their heart, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are a strength to me, through Yahweh of hosts, their Elohim. And in that day I make the leaders of Yahudah like a fire pot among trees, and like a torch of fire in the sheaves. And they shall consume all the peoples all around, on the right and on the left. And Jerusalem shall dwell again in her own place, in Jerusalem. So it's interesting that it says, and Jerusalem shall dwell again in her own place, in Jerusalem, as if they moved it, which is a belief that some have. I do believe that the place where the temple should be was moved, but I'm not sure about the whole city, as some believe. Some believe that it was in, well, closer to, um, well, in Africa, like right in the middle. While there are other beliefs, and I know it's very close or on the end of Africa, but I mean right in the middle is where some believe it would be. So see how it says, and Jerusalem shall dwell again in her own place. In reality, it's not talking about Jerusalem as the city, it's talking about Jerusalem as his people. Because it says, and Jerusalem, meaning the people of Jerusalem, those who follow the instruction of Shalom, those who want Shalom, those who want peace, shall dwell again in her own place. The people of Yahweh, the bride, will dwell again in her own place in Jerusalem. So that also confirms what I have mentioned regarding what Yahushua says in Matthew 24 and Luke 17, Mark 13, when he says, those who are in Yahudah flee to the mountains. Although that was literal in year 70, we need to understand it in the spiritual sense in our time, in which Yahudah refers to the chosen few who praise Yahweh. Therefore, Yahudah is his people. And wherever you are, if you are a Yahudi in Yahushua, you should flee when the time comes for the abomination of desolation to manifest on this earth, claiming to be the Christ. So we see here, and Jerusalem shall dwell again in her own place, in Jerusalem. So that means that this is after the war of Har Megiddo. because this won't happen until that happens, according to what we see in the prophecies all over the scriptures, not only the prophets, but the book of Revelation. All over the scriptures, we see that we won't be able to live, live in peace in Jerusalem until everything happens, all the plagues, and then the war of Armageddon. In that day, I make the leaders of Yehudah like a fire pot among trees. So the nations will be like trees, and we will be like a fire pot that will destroy them, will consume them. Because remember that the first came as the water, the last comes as the fire. When the chosen few are filled with the fire, Yahweh will use them to get rid of evil. That's verse 6. That's nice. You see how it says, in that day, I will put, they say make. So I will make the thousands of Yehudah. How does it say the leaders? Oh yeah. Alufei. Leaders. Alfei would be thousands, remember? But anyways, the leaders of Yehudah, it says Kekior Esh. The kaf right here is like. So like pots of fire, it says, or fire pots, right? This is like. If we take this away, then it would be Kior Esh. Let me write it without the vowels. So they translate it nowadays as the fire sink. But remember that there are 4 words, I mean 4 letters, which are the ones in the name Yonat that sometimes are taken or added to a word and doesn't change the word. If we take away that Yud, which is the hand, we can form that name, which means oven of fire. So she says Cyrus because that's how they translate it, which is cool. So I just wanted to check what words it was using because of what I was saying also regarding how, remember how when Mashiach came, John the Baptist, Yahuhanan the Immerser, he said that he came immersing in water, but one would come who would immerse in spirit and fire. Yahushua came and he immersed the congregation in spirit during the feast of Shavuot, but we don't see any part in scriptures that mentions the immersion in fire because that's what would happen in the second manifestation. John the Baptist, as many did, was seeing the first and last as one manifestation. So he was expecting the same manifestation to bring both the spirit immersion and also the fire one. We see here that the fire would come at the end, and that is why in that day I make the leaders of Yahudah, meaning the chosen few, like a fire pot among trees, and like a torch of fire in the sheaves. A torch of fire. Now I find this also quite, oh, I'm so tired of that appearing every time I want to select a thing just to show it. So I need to stop doing it. There's another verse. That goes very well with this, and I hope I don't go for too long talking about this. Well, let me read it somewhere else. So when Abraham, here, chapter 15 of Genesis, made a covenant with Yahweh, let me read from here. And he said to him, I am Yahweh who brought you out of Ur Kasdim to give you this land to inherit it. And he said, Sovereign Yahweh, whereby do I know that I possess it? And he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. These two represent the two manifestations of the Ruach. Remember that Mashiach received the Ruach as a dove that came upon him. So these two birds represent the two manifestations of the Ruach HaKodesh as the first and the last. The ram is connected to Eliyahu, the goat to Mashiach, the heifer to the last. And the ministry of the last would be 3.5 years. The ministry of Eliyahu would be 3.5 years. Same with the ministry of Mashiach. But that is not all. I said I wasn't going to keep talking. And he took all these to him and cut them in the middle and placed each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. The Ruach represents being omnipresent, while the others represented the separation that this reality creates, or that this reality is and represents, in fact, because everything in this reality was separated in twos. Duality, as I always mention, right and left, man and woman, sun and moon, up and down, front, back, hot, cold, water, fire, etc. Everything, And therefore, the two parts of each of those animals has also to do with, I repeat, the manifestation of Yahweh as first and last in two different times. Mashiach came 2,000 years ago, and opposite to it, the last in the end times. So it says, and he took all these to him and cut them in the middle and placed each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. And the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, and Abraham drove them away. And it came to be when the sun was going down and a deep sleep fell upon Abraham, that a frightening great darkness fell upon him, representing the end of times. And he said to Abraham, know for certain that your seed are to be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. As I have mentioned, Israel was in Egypt, yet they were not there for 400 years. They were there for 210. And of those 210, nearly half of it was as slaves. So the 400 years didn't manifest or were not fulfilled in that time. That refers to our time, pretty much the last 400 years of history. But the nation whom they serve, I am going to judge. That is pretty much starting. And afterward, let them come out with great possessions. Now, as for you, you are to go to your fathers in peace. You are to be buried at a good old age. Then in the fourth generation, they shall return here, for the crookedness of the Amorites is not yet complete. And it came to be, this is the part, when the sun went down and it was dark, that a smoking oven and a burning torch passing between those pieces. So that is the coming of the last with Eliyahu. Eliyahu brought fire from heaven. Eliyahu represents the time of the prophets, in which Hillel was ruling over the heavens. So Eliyahu has a lot to do with punishment or condemnation or bringing judgment. And that is why also John the Baptist, who was Eliyahu, had to die before Mashiach died. So he was still part of the previous dispensation. Now, after Mashiach, everything began anew in the spirit. So now Eliyahu has to come again as one of the two witnesses. So the torch is a term that is used in the negative to refer to Lucifer, in the positive to refer to Eliyahu, and there's a connection between the two. So here we see a smoking oven and a burning torch. Those represent the two witnesses manifesting in the end times of darkness to bring light, passing between those pieces. So that is verse 17. Here uses a different word. In this case, is tanur for oven, And then lapid esh, that is the torch of fire. The oven of smoke, pretty much. Ashan, which makes reference to the steam of Yahweh, which is seen like a smoke or a cloud, thick cloud. So it's very similar to what we see here, like a fire pot among trees and like a torch of fire in the sheaves, right? And this is an interesting connection also because we just saw in Genesis the promise that Yahweh made to Abraham, and now we see in Zechariah a prophecy about the very end of times. And we see the connection through the words that Yahweh is using, like saying that which Abraham saw when I made the covenant with him and told him what would happen to his people will manifest in the end when this that Zechariah is prophesying will happen. You see here, lapid esh. So the torch of fire is using exactly the same words. For the part torch of fire is using the same exact words used in Genesis. The other one is a bit different. Kior esh instead of tanur asham. All right. But they seem to refer to the same idea, the same concept of an oven, or there was another word that I used earlier that we. So we see a confirmation of the manifestation of that prophecy in our time that was given to Abraham at the very beginning. So in that day, I make the leaders of Yehudah like a fire pot among trees and like a torch of fire in the sheaves. So now when we connect the two, and obviously in one interpretation, this refers to the 144,000, like when the script, oh, come on, like when the scriptures in the book of Revelation mention the one who overcomes. So those who overcome are the leaders. Those are the chosen few. But it speaks normally in the singular, he who overcomes, referring to one, the last, and then in the plural to the chosen few. So comparing it to what we saw in Genesis, this will refer to witness like Eliyahu, the witness. I know. Come, I need to stop it. I need to stop it. I need to stop it. I don't know how to do it because I want to select it so you guys can see it, but then that appears and it blocks the whole view. So, like a fire pot referring to the last, and like a torch of fire referring to Eliyahu. So it's funny that he's mentioning the leaders of Yahudah as saying, I will make the two witnesses as leaders of Yahudah, one like a fire pot among the trees who are the chosen. Remember that the trees are the chosen in the book of Revelation, and like a torch of fire in the sheaves. And that also makes reference to the harvest. And remember that during the harvest, that's another connection that we can see in Revelation 14 says, and I looked and saw a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like the son of Adam, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another messenger came out of the dwelling place, crying with a loud voice to the one sitting on the cloud, send your sickle and reap, because the hour has come for you to reap, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. So the first harvest is that of the wheat, and that is when the last, who is now one with the first, appears and takes the chosen few. After that, it says, and another messenger came out of the dwelling place, which is in the heaven, and he too held a sharp sickle. And another messenger came out from the slaughter place, having authority over the fire, right? Like the torch of fire. And he cried with a loud cry to him, having the sharp sickle, saying, send your sharp sickle and gather the cluster of the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. So we see that it mentions two who will harvest the wheat and the grapes, the few and the many. And when he mentions the one who will harvest the many, it says that he had authority over the fire. So going back to Zechariah, in that day I make the leaders of Yahudah like a fire pot among trees, and like a torch of fire in the sheaves. And they shall consume all the peoples around on the right and on the left. And Jerusalem shall dwell again in her own place in Jerusalem. And Yahweh shall save the tents of Yehudah first. Another confirmation of many things that we have spoken about here. And I shall save, remember the difference between salvation and justification. The few who are represented by the name Yehudah will be saved. The many who are represented by the name Jacob or Israel, depending on the context, will be justified. So after mentioning this verse that has to do with the harvest as well, says, and Yahweh shall save the tents of Yehudah first. The tents. Let me see what word is being used for tent. Vehoshia, right? Yahweh, Vehoshia, Yahweh. And will save Yahweh the tents of Yehudah. Ahalei, as in Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. And you know how this makes reference to the time of Sukkot, because Yahweh told us to celebrate Sukkot to remember how the people lived in tents in the desert. So during Sukkot is when the chosen few will have to flee, and that is when the salvation will manifest during the seventh trumpet. And Yahweh shall save the tents of Yehudah first, which confirms what we just read in the book of Revelation, chapter 14. The chosen few, who are the wheat, will be harvested first after they fled to the mountains to be in tents. And Yahweh shall save the tents of Yehudah first. So only in that part we see three things. Salvation for those who are in tents, meaning during Sukkot. Yehudah, the chosen few, first, as we saw the wheat being harvested first in Revelation 14. So that the comeliness of the house of David and the comeliness of the inhabitants of Jerusalem would not become greater than that of Yehudah. And Yahweh shall save the tents of Yehudah first, so that the comeliness of the house of David and the comeliness of the inhabitants of Jerusalem would not become greater than that of Yehudah. In that day, Yahweh shall shield the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the feeble among them in that day shall be like David. Look at that and how powerful, and that is something that we have also mentioned in previous studies. How the chosen few, scripture says that they are, let me read it correctly. So Revelation 3, when it talks to the congregation of the chosen few, because you have guarded my word of endurance, Yahushua, the name, I also shall guard you from the hour of trial which shall come upon all the world to try those who dwell on the earth. It says here, I know your works. See, I have set before you an open door. Yahushua is the door. John 10. And no one is able to shut it, that you have little power. That you have little power, yet have guarded my word and have not denied my name. So his name, Yahweh, his word, Yahushua. By having the word and his name, we have all the power, because we can do all things through Mashiach who strengthens us. But while we are in the flesh, we have little power. We still have weaknesses. We still have to work on ourselves. We still have to grow, to continue, to sometimes struggle, etc. But in that day, Yahweh shall shield the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the feeble among them in that day shall be like David. So the weakest of all of the 144,000 will be as strong as King David. And the feeble among them in that day shall be like David. And the house of David like Elohim, like the messenger of Yahweh before them. This is such a powerful, powerful verse and what it means. So first, in that day, once again, end times shall shield, as we just read, Yahweh will protect the chosen few, will guard them from the hour of trial that is to come upon the world. the inhabitants of Jerusalem, those who dwell in the instruction of shalom, those who want shalom and instruct themselves on how to achieve it. And the feeble, those who are weak among them, 144,000, in that day, transformation, the harvest, shall be like David, like the king. And that is because, remember that, genetically speaking, Yahushua came from David. Then, after he dies and resurrects, those who are in Yahushua become one with him, his body. For there is no Greek nor Yahudi, but we are all one. So now the last comes to gather the chosen few, but the only way he can do so is by connecting himself to Mashiach, who is the root. So he becomes the branch that will give fruit, who are the few, the chosen. So since the chosen will be connected to the branch and the branch to the root, then the few will be like the last, and the last will be like the first, who is like Yahweh. So then we will all be connected. We will all be one, like Yahushua prayed to Yahweh for it to happen, for us to be one with him. So look how it goes here. It says, among the feeble among them in that day shall be like David. And the house of David, meaning his family. So now he's saying the house of David, as in David is already around again. Could obviously be because of the resurrection, but we're talking here about the transformation in the end time. So that David represents the branch of David, the last, who gathers the chosen few, who will be his spiritual children. So they are the house of David. They are his house, and they will be like him. So they shall be like David, and the house of David like Elohim. So now the house of David, the chosen few, will be Elohim on earth. They will represent Yahweh on this earth. Remember how Moshe was Elohim and Aharon his prophet? And then there were 70 elders who received the Ruach of Moshe that represents the 70 nations receiving the Ruach from the witness like Moshe. Now, in this case, the few receiving the Ruach from the last, the witness like Moshe, in order for them to be together a body that will rule over all creation, being the representation of Yahweh on earth. Yahushua at the right hand in heaven. So that's why they shall be like David, and the house of David like Elohim. The change of bodies, first of all, to be physically like the Elohim, like the Malachim, but spiritually and in authority, the representation of Yahweh Elohim on the earth. In the house of David like Elohim. And then he says, like the messenger of Yahweh before them. So that is saying that David that it is talking about is the messenger of Yahweh. So the David that is being talked about in this verse refers to Mikael, the Malach of Yahweh, right? So in this verse, we're seeing that the Malach of Yahweh, Mikael, would come to fulfill the part of the branch of David through Yahushua, who is the root of David. And once that happens, the chosen few that are gathered will become like him, who is the messenger of Yahweh, and happens to be Elohim, for he is the representative of the creator. I hope all of that is understood. And this verse also confirms that the term Elohim is used for Malachim. For he says they will be like Elohim. Like what? Like the messenger of Yahweh. Right? Verse 8. Now, look at this. This is interesting. Well, let me see something else and then I'll show it. So when it says, like David, is writing David with an extra letter. One of those letters that I mentioned that sometimes appears, sometimes it doesn't. So it is like would be the letter Kaf. like David, right? So see, like David. And this numerical value of this word, like David, is 44 like that, which is the numerical value of the word Abiel, which is my father is the mighty one. Abiel, my father is the mighty one, which is powerful because remember that Yahushua came as the son, the last comes as the father, the last being that David. So they will be like David. They will be like my father, the mighty one, who is Elohim, etc., that we just saw on that verse. Obviously, because it is a similar name, Eliav, my mighty one, is father. That is when he will become the father of the chosen few. Rest in that Luach, which is like the tablets of the commandments written by Moshe, also the finger of Yahweh. Yelet, same numerical value as like David, which means a child. So when he says they will be like David, can also be interpreted as they will be children of Yahweh. They will become children of Yahweh. And just David, the way it was written, has a numerical value of 24, which is the numerical value of Dodi, which is my beloved, as the chosen few will become beloved. All right. So like Elohim, like the Malach of Yahweh before them. So confirms the previous verses, the harvest, the coming of the Malach of Yahweh as David to receive the chosen few and make them one with Yahweh through Mashiach. Verse 9. And it shall be in that day that I seek to destroy all nations that come against Jerusalem. That I seek to destroy all nations that come against Jerusalem. Har-Megiddo. And I shall pour on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of favor and prayers. And they shall look on me whom they pierced. This is such a powerful verse. And I just find it amazing, either the blindness or the rebellion of the Jewish people who claim to believe the Torah, the scriptures, the prophets, yet they don't, obviously, because the scriptures are clear regarding who is Mashiach and how he would die and the fact that he came and they pierced him. And Yahweh is saying it clearly, and they shall look on me whom they pierced, showing that Mashiach is the manifestation of Yahweh. For they pierced Mashiach, yet Yahweh says, me whom they pierced. And I wonder, really, I mean, what would they say regarding this verse? That is something that still needs to be fulfilled and he will be pierced in a different way, whatever. Or pierced in his heart metaphorically because of the pain that he feels through the idolatry of the people. Something like that. Yet we know how clear it is and how literal it becomes when we understand the story of Mashiach. And they shall look on me whom they pierced, and they shall mourn for him. You see, this is interesting. Me or him? First, he says it in first person, and then he says it in third person, right? And they shall look on me, and they shall mourn for him, right? Hope that is being understood. So it can be seen as he being the manifest, like Yahweh who got in the flesh as Mashiach, Yahushua. But once he became flesh, there was a separation from the Ruach of the Most High and the body, which now encapsulated the soul of Yahweh, his image. So by him becoming a human, came down from that level in which he remains, for he is omnipresent. And therefore, he says they shall look on me whom they pierced, because is his first manifestation. Yet that first manifestation is an extension of himself, and therefore they shall mourn him, right? They shall mourn Mashiach, who happens to be Yahweh. Another way to put it is, they shall look on me whom they pierce, Yahushua, and they shall mourn for him, the last whom they will kill, right? So, and they shall look on me whom they pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourns for his only son. So we cannot imagine the pain, because that is pretty much the worst that a person can go through. I don't doubt some people may say there are worse things, but I can just not imagine such a pain, for it is not natural, and it is the death of somebody whose love cannot be compared to anything. And he says not only a son, but only son. And we're talking about somebody who actually loves his or her children, not the type of parents of nowadays. And they shall mourn for him as one mourns for his only son. So they shall mourn, no doubt about that. They will regret doing what they did to Mashiach and what they will do to the last. And they shall be in bitterness over him as bitterness over the firstborn. So you see how it confirms both interpretations. Not only that Yahweh is first and last, not only that Yahweh, once he becomes the first or the last, remains as the highest, as the most high, separated from those two manifestations who became flesh, but also, see, and they shall look on me whom they pierced, first manifestation, and they shall mourn for him, second manifestation, as one mourns for his only son. The only son is Yahushua HaMashiach. So in that sense, we can connect it to that him, of course. His only son. Remember what Yahushua said to Abraham, give me your only son. Yet he had Ishmael, but Yitzhak was the only son promised by Yahweh. And that was to represent Yahushua. That's why Abraham said to Yitzhak, Yahweh will provide a lamb. And then he sacrificed a ram. So that meant that the lamb had to come in the future, and that is Yahushua, who came as the lamb to die instead of Yitzhak. So Yitzhak is the only son and represents Yahushua as the only son, the only begotten son, as the scripture also calls him. But the last, who is as Yahusef, who is as Jacob, who is as Ephraim, he receives becoming firstborn, even though he was born second or last or afterwards. Even though he comes last, Yahweh gives him that right of the firstborn, because he also becomes the first among the 144,000 who are children. So he's the firstborn. Yahushua, the only, because he came as the seed, and he said that the seed has to die alone in order to grow and give fruit. So Mashiach came first as the only begotten son, and then the last, through Mashiach, becomes firstborn among the 144,000. So only son refers to the first, firstborn to the last. Yitzhak, Jacob, first and last. And here Yahweh mentions both, because the world will mourn for both when it realizes who they are and what they went through and how the world rejected them. So I repeat this verse because it's very powerful. And I shall pour on the house of David and on the house, pardon, I'm sorry. And I shall pour on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of favor and prayers. And they shall look on me whom they pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourns for his only son. And they shall be in bitterness over him as a bitterness over the firstborn. So this first part, just to make sure that people understand that Yahweh himself is both first and last. That's why he says me, not only me, but they pierced to make sure people understand that they killed him when he came. But then separates his manifestation as two males, him, only son, firstborn. They shall mourn for him. They shall be in bitterness over him. Hope that's clear. It's very powerful, very important, and reason why Yahweh says it in that way. Habekor, Habekor, the firstborn. This is also very powerful. Let me take this word. Al Hayachid, the only one. We have the Lamed Ayin 37. Well, the word, let me put it here. Yachid, the only one. You see how here we have it without the article. Yachid, you can see how it is connected to Yechidah, the highest level of the soul, when you become one with the Father. Yechidah, which would be pretty much this. Yachid, the only one. You see how here we also have the word echad, or the root of it is echad, which is one. And we know that Yahweh becomes one with us through Yahushua, the Messiah. He is the only way. So that's why he is the Yachid. He is the one who unites. He is the one, right? The other one is the firstborn. The firstborn. They write it as eldest because the firstborn normally is the eldest unless he receives that birthright as Jacob did and Ephraim and the others. In this case, we have, okay, 220, 200, all right, 26. All right. So, and even here, like we take out the article, we have the core, which is firstborn. This is the letter that represents or has the numerical value of 2. So already has to do with the one who comes second. Not only that, in Hebrew, this word is, or this letter also represents the word with or in. So when it appears at the beginning of a word, it means with. So here the word is bekor, which means firstborn. But if we were to separate this as if it was another word with the letter bet as the prefix, then it would be with kor. And kor, as we saw earlier, is an oven. So with an oven, with fire, right? With the last who comes as the consuming fire, which we just saw already as the oven of fire who came with the torch of fire. So I already said a lot about that. I hope it's clear. 11. In that day, the mourning of Jerusalem is going to be great, like the mourning at Hadad Rimon in the valley of Megiddo. So this refers to something that happened back then, and it is being compared to explain how bad it's going to be. But interestingly enough, it mentions Megiddo, which would connect to the war of Harmegiddo that I already mentioned, that would be the one mentioned here or referred to in this chapter, when everything will end. In that day, the mourning of Jerusalem is going to be great, like the mourning of Hadad Rimon in the valley of Megiddo. Then it says, and the land shall mourn, every clan by itself, the clan of the house of David by itself, and the women by themselves, the clan of the house of Nathan by itself, and their women by themselves, See how it mentions David and then Nathan second, as in the king and the prophet, as in the last and Eliyahu. The clan of the house of Levi by itself, meaning the priests. So it would follow the chosen few. And their women by themselves. The women would represent the many. The clan of Shimi by itself and their women by themselves. Those who are heard by Yahweh. So I mentioned women as the many because of what women represent. But since it mentions a fourth, obviously the women could represent just literal women once we receive the resurrection, but in the metaphorical sense, or by following the symbolism that we see in scriptures, David would be the last. Well, first and last is one, branch and root. Nathan or Nathan would be Eliyahu, the prophet, right next to him. The house of Levi would be the chosen few who will receive the priesthood, but the heavenly one of Melchizedek. Shimi would be the many who would follow the few, and the many will be heard and therefore resurrected. And I say that because of the name that we find here. Let me just make sure. Those who are heard, Shimi. So the many. And in that respect, then the women would be the nations. I repeat, if we are going to separate them. And because of the fact that here they are being separated, all crying or mourning in a separate way. Then it says, all the rest of the clans, every clan by itself, and their women by themselves. And that's how the chapter ends. So I repeat, mainly this will be fulfilled in Revelation 19 during the war of Armageddon, which I have mentioned. Also, it's possible that it will happen in Har Moed, the Mount of the Testimony. So that's how the chapter ends.